When 9-year-old Rosie Callahan sat in the back of a pickup truck outside a Tennessee feed store on a cold Saturday morning in February and locked eyes with a leather-vested stranger filling his gas tank across the lot, she did not wave, she did not call out, she did not smile. She had not smiled at anyone in 2 years, but she held his gaze with the kind of hollow, unblinking stillness that made the man's chest tighten in a way he could not explain and could not ignore. What happened in the next 3 hours would pull a grieving child back from the edge of a silence so complete her own teacher had written in a report that she was unreachable, would expose a wound that a community had chosen to look past because looking at it required too much, and would prove once again that the people least expected to understand a broken child are sometimes the only ones equipped to reach her. The town of Millhaven, Tennessee sat in the fold of a wide valley about 40 minutes east of Nashville, the kind of place where the feed store had been run by the same family for 3 generations, and everyone knew which trucks belonged to which farms before the drivers even stepped out. The hills were brown and dormant in February, the sky the pale white of old bone, and the cold had the particular sharpness of a Tennessee winter that wasn't deep enough to snow, but was mean enough to make you regret not bringing a heavier coat. The parking lot of Callaway's Feed and Supply was a wide rectangle of cracked asphalt that served as the unofficial gathering point for the county's farming families on Saturday mornings. Pickups lined up, men talked over tailgates, kids ran between the tire stacks stacked outside the store's entrance, and the smell of diesel and hay dust hung in the air like something permanent. Carson Brick. Holiday pulled his Road King into the lot at 9:47 in the morning, angling it into the narrow strip designated for motorcycles near the air pump. He was 53 years old, vice president of the Ridge and Valley MC out of Murfreesboro, a broad-shouldered man with a dark beard going silver at the jaw, deep-set brown eyes that missed very little, and hands so scarred and calloused from 30 years of mechanical work that shaking one felt like gripping a tool. His black leather vest bore the Ridge and Valley center patch, a winding road disappearing into a mountain horizon, along with his road name Rocker Brick, earned not for toughness, but for the time he had single-handedly rebuilt the crumbling foundation wall of a Club Brothers house using only hand tools and 3 days of his own time. The vest also carried a small rectangular patch near the bottom left that read, Veterans Outreach Coordinator, because after 2 tours in the Army and a decade of watching brothers come home broken, Carson had decided that doing something about it was more useful than being angry about it. He was in Millhaven because his sister lived 12 miles outside of town, and he had promised to help her replace a water heater that had been failing since November. He had stopped at Callaway's to pick up pipe fittings and had not planned to stop long. He paid for his items at the register, exchanged a few words with the man behind the counter about the weather coming down from Kentucky, and was walking back across the lot toward his bike when he noticed the truck. It was an older model Ford, dark green, parked at the far edge of the lot near the propane exchange station. A man he took to be the father was inside the store, visible through the plate glass window, talking to someone at the back counter. In the bed of the truck, sitting on a folded moving blanket that someone had placed there as a kind of cushion against the metal, was a girl. 9 years old, maybe 10, small for her age, wearing a dark green puffy coat that was slightly too large and jeans that had a small iron-on patch on one knee. Her brown hair was pulled back in a ponytail that had been done carefully, which meant someone that morning had taken the time to care for her appearance, even if nothing else about her posture suggested she noticed or welcomed it. She had her arms wrapped around her knees, her chin resting on top of them, and she was staring at nothing. Not at the parking lot, not at the people moving around it, not at the sky. At nothing. At some fixed point in the middle distance that only she could see. Carson had a niece around the same age. He knew what 9-year-old girls looked like in parking lots on Saturday mornings. They fidgeted. They checked their phones or begged for them. They complained about the cold. They hopped down from truck beds and ran to look at things that caught their attention. They existed loudly and impatiently in the way children of that age were supposed to. This girl did none of those things. She sat with the motionless quality of someone who had learned that stillness was safer than movement and quieter than speech. He would have kept walking. He almost did. Then she looked up. Their eyes met across 40 feet of cracked asphalt, and Carson stopped walking without deciding to stop. The girl's eyes were dark brown and very large, and they were not the eyes of a child who was simply bored or cold or annoyed at having been dragged along on a Saturday errand. They were the eyes of a child who had been somewhere very dark and had not yet found her way back out. He had seen that look before. He had seen it in the faces of young soldiers coming back from their second and third deployments. He had seen it in the face of his own mother in the months after his father died. He had seen it in the mirror for a period of his own life he did not discuss at club events. He did not look away. Neither did she. After a moment, he walked over, not directly at her, which would have felt aggressive, but toward the propane exchange station nearby, approaching at an angle that gave her time to read him as harmless before he got close. He stopped a respectful distance from the truck and looked up at her from below, which put her slightly above him and gave her the height advantage children always needed when talking to large men in leather. "Hey there," he said. "Cold morning to be sitting outside." The girl looked at him. She did not respond. She also did not look away, which he took as permission to continue. "You waiting for your dad?" A small nod, barely a movement at all. Carson leaned against the tailgate of the neighboring truck, giving her space, not crowding the moment. He looked out at the lot for a few seconds the way adults did when they weren't trying to force a conversation, just sharing the same air. "I like your patch," he said, nodding at her knee. The iron-on was a small embroidered sunflower, yellow and slightly faded from washing. She looked down at her knee as if she had forgotten the patch was there. Then she looked back up at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile, not warmth exactly, but a fractional loosening of whatever she was holding in place behind her face. "My mom put it on," she said. Her voice was small and careful, and even in those 5 words, it was possible to hear that she had not been using it much. Carson nodded slowly. "She's got good taste." The girl looked at the sunflower again. "She did it every time," the girl said. "Every time I ripped my jeans, she put a flower patch. She has a whole box of them." She paused. Had. The word landed in the cold air between them like something dropped. Carson did not rush to fill the silence. He did not say he was sorry or immediately pivot to something lighter or do any of the things people reflexively did when a child handed them grief they did not know how to hold. He just stayed where he was, settled and unhurried, and let the word exist. After a moment he said, "She sounds like she was real thoughtful." "She was," the girl said. And then, as if the word had opened a door she hadn't meant to open, her chin came off her knees and she straightened slightly and said, "Her name was Diane. She was a nurse. She made really good biscuits and she smelled like lavender, and she was teaching me to play guitar before she got sick." Carson listened. He did not interrupt, and he did not redirect, and he did not look at his watch. He listened the way people listened when they understood that being heard was not a courtesy extended to children, but a necessity as fundamental as food and warmth. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today and what time it is where you are, because this story is going to remind you that grief in a child doesn't always look like crying. Sometimes it looks like stillness. Sometimes it looks like a little girl sitting alone in the bed of a truck on a cold February morning, holding a silence so heavy it has its own weight, waiting without knowing she's waiting for someone who will finally let her put it down. Her name was Rosie. Rosie Ann Callahan. She was 9 years old, and she had lost her mother to ovarian cancer 14 months earlier, after a 7-month illness that had taken Diane Callahan from diagnosis to death in the time it took Rosie to finish 3rd grade and start 4th. Her father, whose name was Gene, was a decent man by every account in Millhaven, a farmer who worked hard and paid his bills and had loved his wife sincerely, but who was himself so swamped in grief that he had confused surviving with moving forward and had made the common and devastating mistake of believing that the best thing for his daughter was to not dwell. "Don't dwell, Rosie. We have to keep going. Your mama would want us to keep going." The words meant to protect had instead built walls, and behind those walls Rosie had gone somewhere interior and quiet where nobody seemed able to reach her. Her teacher, a woman named Mrs. Pratt, who had been teaching 4th grade at Millhaven Elementary for 19 years and who genuinely cared about her students, had written in Rosie's fall semester report that the child demonstrated significant emotional withdrawal and difficulty engaging with peers or classroom activities. and that the school counselor had met with Rosie 4 times without meaningful progress. Mrs. Pratt had noted, with the particular exhaustion of a caring person who has run out of tools, that Rosie appeared unreachable and that outside intervention was recommended. It was a clinical way of saying the same thing Carson had read in the girl's eyes from 40 feet away, that Rosie Callahan had gone somewhere nobody had yet been willing to follow her. Gene Callahan came out of the feed store at 10:06 carrying a paper bag and looking like a man who had learned to function on insufficient sleep and too much coffee. He was in his early 40s, lean and weathered, with Rosie's same dark eyes and the particular bearing of a man who held himself responsible for things outside his control. He stopped when he saw the biker at the tailgate of the neighboring truck talking to his daughter, and his expression went through the familiar sequence: wariness, assessment, guarded readiness. Then he looked at Rosie's face and stopped. She was talking, not smiling, not laughing, but talking, with her chin off her knees and her hands moving slightly as she described something, and her eyes directed at another human being rather than at the middle distance where she usually lived. Gene Callahan stood at the edge of the parking lot for a moment and did not interrupt. He watched his daughter talk to a stranger and felt something loosen in his chest that had been locked tight for 14 months. Carson noticed him and stood straight, giving the man a nod that communicated clearly. "I know she's yours. I mean, no harm. I was just listening." Gene walked over. "You the man talking to my girl?" "Yes, sir. Name's Carson Holliday, Ridge and Valley MC out of Murfreesboro. Your daughter told me about her mother. I hope that was all right." Gene looked at Rosie, who had gone quiet again, but had not retreated entirely behind the wall. She was watching her father with an expression that was equal parts hope and wariness, as if she was waiting to find out whether what she had just done was going to be welcomed or managed. Gene Callahan was not a complicated man. He looked at the biker, and he looked at his daughter, and he made a simple calculation that had nothing to do with leather vests or road names or any of the associations people carried. He asked himself whether this stranger had done something in the last 15 minutes that he himself had failed to do in 14 months. The answer sat heavy and honest in his chest. He set his paper bag on the tailgate, crossed his arms, and said, "She hasn't talked about her mama to anybody since the funeral." Carson nodded. "She loved her a lot. It's pretty clear." "She did." Gene's voice was rough. "We both did." He paused. "I didn't know she was still carrying it this hard. I thought not talking about it meant she was okay, that she was adjusting. The school sent me a report last month that said she was unreachable, and I didn't know what to do with that word. Unreachable. Like she was somewhere I couldn't get to." Carson looked at Rosie, who was listening to every word. He believed children should be allowed to hear the truth about themselves when it was spoken with love rather than fear. He said, "She's not unreachable. She just needed someone to stay in the cold with her long enough to make it worth talking." Gene looked at his daughter and said her name once, softly. Rosie. And Rosie Callahan, who had not smiled in 2 years, did not smile then either. But she reached out and put her small hand on top of her father's forearm, and that was enough. That was more than enough. Carson did not leave after that. He had not planned to stay. He had a water heater to replace, and a sister who was expecting him before noon, and a list of reasons to get back on the Road King and point it toward the highway. But there are moments in a person's life when the thing in front of them is more important than the thing they were headed toward, and Carson Holliday had lived long enough and lost enough to recognize those moments when they arrived. He stayed. Gene invited him inside Callaway's for coffee, the kind of invitation that in small Tennessee towns carried real weight, that said, "I have decided to trust you, and I am asking you to sit at the same table with my family." Carson accepted without hesitation. He called his sister from the parking lot, told her the water heater was going to have to wait until afternoon, listened to her laugh and tell him that was fine, that it had waited since November, and another few hours wouldn't hurt it any. Then he followed Gene and Rosie through the front door of the feed store and into the small seating area near the back where a coffee station and 4 mismatched chairs constituted Callaway's informal gathering space for regulars. Rosie sat across from Carson with a cup of hot chocolate that the man behind the counter had made for her without being asked, which suggested she was enough of a regular that her preferences were known. She wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at Carson with those large, still eyes that he was beginning to understand were not emptiness, but attention. She was paying close attention to everything. She had just learned to do it from a place so far inside herself that most people couldn't see it happening. Gene got his coffee and sat down, and for a moment nobody said anything, which was fine. Carson had spent enough time around people in grief to know that silence was not always a problem to be solved. Then Rosie said, "Do you have kids?" It wasn't a question with a rising inflection. She stated it flatly in the way children sometimes did when they were asking something they weren't entirely sure they were allowed to ask, hedging against the social risk by making it sound almost like an observation. Carson shook his head. "No, never had any." "Got a niece about your age, though. She lives up near Louisville." Rosie considered this. "Does she have a mom?" "She does," Carson said. Rosie nodded slowly and looked at her hot chocolate. Then she said, "I used to think that everybody had a mom because that's just how it was. But then my mom died, and I started noticing all the kids whose moms were gone. There's a girl in my class named April whose mom left when she was 4. And there's a boy named Devin whose mom is sick. And I never noticed before because I didn't know to look." Carson said, "Grief teaches you to see things you couldn't see before." Rosie looked up at him. Her expression was the particular seriousness of a child who has been thinking about something for a long time and has not yet found a grown-up willing to think about it with her. "Is that good or bad?" she asked. Carson thought about it honestly, which she deserved. He said, "Both. It makes some things harder and some things clearer. And eventually the clearer part starts to matter more than the harder part, but it takes time to get there. A lot of time." "How much time?" He looked at her steadily. He did not flinch from the question, and he did not soften it into something easier. "Different for everybody," he said, "but more than 14 months, if that's what you're asking." Something in Rosie's face moved. Not relief exactly, but the particular release of a child who has been told a hard, true thing by an adult who respected her enough not to lie. She nodded once, a small and serious nod, and looked back at her cup. Gene was watching this exchange with the expression of a man trying to understand how a stranger had in 20 minutes reached terrain that he had been unable to find in over a year. His jaw was tight and his eyes were bright, and he was holding his coffee cup with both hands, the way people held things when they needed something to hold. He said, "She doesn't talk to her school counselor or to her teacher. I've had people over, neighbors, women from the church who knew Diane, and Rosie just sits there. Just goes somewhere else. I didn't know what else to do except keep going, keep the routine, feed the animals, get her to school, do the laundry. I thought stability was what she needed." "It is," Carson said, "but stability and silence aren't the same thing. Kids can tell the difference between a house that runs on schedule and a house where they're allowed to say her name out loud." Gene set his cup down on the table. He said his wife's name, Diane, and it came out like something he had been keeping in a closed room for too long. Then he said, "I couldn't hear it. Every time Rosie said her mama's name, I could feel it coming up from somewhere, and I'd change the subject or say something about keeping going, or I'd just leave the room. I thought I was protecting her. I think maybe I was protecting myself." Carson said nothing. He let the man have the admission without putting anything on top of it. Gene looked at his daughter, who was listening without pretending not to. He said, "Rosie, I'm sorry. I think I made it harder by trying to make it easier." Rosie looked at her father for a long moment. Then she said, "I know, Daddy. I know you miss her too. I just didn't want to be the only one who talked about it." If you believe that children in grief deserve to have their loss witnessed rather than managed, and if this story is reminding you that sometimes the most important thing an adult can do is simply refuse to change the subject, take a moment right now to subscribe to Bike Diaries and hit that like button. We upload a new story every single day, and every single one of them exists to prove that ordinary people doing extraordinary things are everywhere, if you know how to look. They stayed at Callaway's for an hour and 40 minutes. Carson talked about his own losses, not in a way that made the conversation about him, but in a way that showed Rosie and Jean that grief was not a shameful private failure, but a common human condition that people of all sizes and ages and backgrounds carried. He talked about losing his father when he was 19, about how nobody in his family had known how to talk about it, so they had all just moved around each other in silence for years, bumping into the absence like furniture in a dark room. He talked about a club brother named Paulie Wren who had died of a heart attack 3 years earlier, and how the Ridge and Valley MC had made it a point to say Paulie's name at every gathering since, to keep him in the room, because the alternative was a kind of second death that felt worse than the first. Rosie listened to all of it. She asked questions that were precise and unguarded, the way children's questions were when they felt safe enough to ask what they actually wanted to know. She asked whether Carson had ever been so sad he couldn't eat. She asked whether it ever stopped hurting or just got different. She asked whether he thought her mother could see her from wherever she was. Carson answered each one with the same honest care he had given every other question, not reaching for comfort that wasn't earned, not dismissing the weight behind the asking. To the last question he said, "I don't know for certain, nobody does, but I'll tell you what I think. I think the people who loved us don't just stop. I think love that's strong leaves a mark on the world and on the people it touched. And I think your mama is in the way you talk, and the way you notice things, and the way you put your hand on your daddy's arm out there in the parking lot. I think that's her in you, still moving around in the world." Rosie was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, "She used to call me her sunflower, because I always turned toward the sun." Carson looked at the iron-on patch on her knee, the small faded flower her mother had pressed there with a hot iron and patient hands. He said, "Then maybe it's time to start turning again." It was not a command. It was not advice of the kind that came with an expectation. It was the kind of thing you said to someone when you believed they were capable of it, and the believing itself was a form of gift. Outside the feed store, the morning had moved toward noon, and the parking lot had thinned as families finished their errands and headed home. Jean paid for their drinks over Carson's objection, and the three of them walked out into the cold, which had not warmed much, but felt different than it had 2 hours earlier. Jean put his bag in the cab of the truck, and then stood at the tailgate with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at Carson with the expression of a man who had received something he didn't know how to account for. "I don't know how to thank you," Jean said. Carson shook his head. "Don't. I just sat down." "You stayed," Jean said. That was the part that mattered. Everybody else either didn't notice or noticed and kept walking. You stayed in the cold and you listened and you didn't tell her to move on. That's not a small thing. That's the thing. Carson looked at Rosie, who was standing beside her father with her hands tucked into her coat pockets, watching him with those serious dark eyes. He said, "She's going to be okay. She's tough in the way quiet people are tough, which is the toughest kind. But she needs to be able to say her mama's name at home. She needs a place where Diane is still allowed to exist." Jean's jaw worked. "I know that now," he said. "I didn't before. I do now." Carson reached into the inner pocket of his vest and pulled out one of the Ridge and Valley MC community cards, a plain white card with the club name, his personal number, and the words Veterans and Community Outreach across the bottom. He held it out to Jean. He said, "There's a woman who rides with our auxiliary. Her name is Patrice. She lost her husband 4 years ago, and she does grief support work with families. Not formal therapy, just human. She's good at it. If Rosie ever wants to talk to someone who knows what this road looks like, I'd like to give Patrice your number if that's okay with you." Jean took the card. He held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment. Then he said, Yeah, I think that would be real good." Carson pulled on his gloves and swung his leg over the Road King. The engine turned over with a sound that filled the quiet lot, deep and steady and immediate. He looked at Rosie one last time. She was still watching him. He said, "Hey, Sunflower." She looked at him. "Your mama sounds like she was something else." And Rosie Callahan, who had not smiled in 2 years, produced something that was not quite a full smile but was unmistakably its beginning. The corners of her mouth moved, her eyes changed. It was small and cautious and real, and it lasted only a second before she pulled it back in. But it had been there. Jean saw it. Carson saw it. And the morning held it like something that mattered. Carson gave a single nod, pulled out of the lot onto the county road, and pointed the road king toward his sister's house in the hills. Behind him, Gene Callahan crouched down in the feed store parking lot and put his arms around his daughter, and Rosie led him. And for the first time in 14 months, she said her mother's name out loud into his shoulder, and Gene did not change the subject, and neither of them left the room. Patrice Dumond was 51 years old, a compact and direct woman with close-cropped silver hair and the particular calm of someone who had walked through fire and come out the other side not unburned but unbroken. She rode a Sportster she had bought herself 3 months after her husband's funeral as an act of deliberate reclamation, a way of saying that her life was still hers, and she intended to live it on her own terms. She was not a therapist and did not pretend to be one. She was a woman who had lost her person and had learned, slowly and at great cost, how to carry that loss without being flattened by it, and she had decided that the most useful thing she could do with that knowledge was give it away freely to anyone who needed it. Carson called her from his sister's driveway that afternoon while the old water heater sat disconnected on the garage floor and the new one waited in its box. He told her about Gene and Rosie Callahan, about the feed store parking lot and the hot chocolate and the iron-on sunflower patch, and the way Rosie had said her mother's name like a door cracking open after a long time shut. Patrice listened without interrupting, which was one of her gifts. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I'll call him tomorrow morning." She did. Gene answered on the second ring, which told Patrice something about how the rest of that Saturday had gone, that he had been waiting for the call without admitting to himself that he was waiting. They talked for 40 minutes. Patrice did not offer techniques or frameworks or clinical language. She asked Gene what Diane had been like, not how she had died or how long she had been sick or what the diagnosis had been, but what she had been like, what she laughed at, what she was particular about, what she had wanted for her daughter. Gene talked for 30 of those 40 minutes without stopping, and at the end his voice was rough and his breathing was unsteady, and he said he hadn't talked about her like that since the week of the funeral, when people had still been asking. Patrice said that was the problem, wasn't it? That people stopped asking, not out of cruelty but out of discomfort, and grief mistook that silence for instruction. She drove out to the Callahan farm the following Saturday. It was a 40-minute drive from Murfreesboro into the valley, past bare-limbed trees and brown fields and the particular stillness of Tennessee farmland in winter. She brought nothing except herself and a thermos of coffee and a photograph of her late husband Marcus that she kept in the breast pocket of her jacket, not to show people but to have with her, as a reminder that she was not speaking from theory. Rosie met her at the door with the same careful evaluation she had turned on Carson at the feed store. The same still eyes, the same calibrating silence. Patrice did not try to warm her way through it. She looked back steadily and said, "Your daddy tells me you're teaching yourself guitar." Rosie blinked. Then she said, trying to. "My mom was teaching me, but I only learned 3 chords before she got sick," Patrice said. 3 chords is more than enough to play 100 songs. You'd be surprised." And just like that, a door opened. Carson heard about all of this in pieces over the following weeks. Patrice called him after her second visit to the farm to tell him that Rosie had shown her a journal she had been keeping since her mother died, pages of small, careful handwriting that turned out to be letters addressed to Diane, things Rosie had wanted to tell her mother and had been writing down because there was nowhere else to put them. Patrice said she had sat on the floor of Rosie's room and listened while the girl read 3 of the letters aloud, which was the first time Rosie had read them to anyone, and that Gene had been standing in the doorway listening and crying without making a sound. Carson drove his route home that evening, thinking about a 9-year-old girl who had filled a journal with letters she had no way to send, who had found the only container available for grief that her house had not been able to hold. And he felt the specific ache of someone who understood that kind of solitary carrying from the inside. The Ridge and Valley MC had a community event the first Saturday of March, a late winter toy and supply drive for 3 families in Rutherford County who had fallen behind after a factory closure the previous fall. 16 bikes gathered at the clubhouse at 8 in the morning, loading saddlebags and trailer with donated goods, while someone's portable speaker played classic rock into the cold air and someone else's wife distributed homemade breakfast sandwiches from a foil-covered pan. It was the kind of morning that reminded Carson why he had joined the club 20 years ago. Not for the riding, though the riding was everything, but for the particular texture of a morning where people showed up for each other without being asked twice. After the run back at the clubhouse with the donations delivered and the bikes cooling down in the lot, Carson mentioned Rosie to his club president, a man named Robert Forge Tillman, who was 60 years old and had founded the Ridge and Valley chapter on the principle that a motorcycle club was only as valuable as the community it served. Forge listened, asked a few questions, and then said, "Bring them to the spring ride. Not as charity, as guests, as people we want to know." Carson thought about it. Then he called Gene Callahan. Gene said he'd have to think about it. He called back 2 days later and said yes, as long as Rosie was on board. He asked Rosie, who had started to come back into herself in ways that were small but measurable, who had eaten a full dinner 3 nights running and had returned to the guitar with a persistence that impressed even Patrice, said she wanted to go. The Ridge and Valley Spring Ride fell on the second Saturday of April, a morning that arrived with the particular generosity of early Tennessee spring, warm sun and green hills, and the smell of something alive returning to the world after the long cold. Jean drove out to the Murfreesboro clubhouse with Rosie in the passenger seat, and she spent the first 10 minutes in the parking lot doing the same thing she had done in the Callaway's lot in February, sitting still and watching, assessing, deciding. But this time, there was no hollow distance in her eyes. She was watching the way a person watched when they were curious rather than afraid. Patrice was there, and the two of them found each other immediately in the way people found each other when they had already established a language. Forge came over and shook Jean's hand and told Rosie in a completely matter-of-fact way that Carson had told him she was learning guitar and that there were 2 other members of the club who played, and that after the ride they were going to set up on the back patio and she was welcome to join if she wanted. Rosie looked at Carson, who gave her a small nod and said okay. They rode out in a column of 16 bikes, Jean and Rosie following in the truck, and spent 3 hours on the winding roads through the hills east of Murfreesboro, where the dogwoods were coming into bloom, and the light fell through new leaves in the particular way it did for only about 2 weeks each year. Rosie watched from the passenger window with her chin on her arm and her eyes tracking the bikes ahead with an attention that Jean recognized. It was the same attention she had given to Carson across the parking lot in February, but warmer now, interested rather than desperate. At the lunch stop, a roadside place with picnic tables and a barbecue pit that the club had been coming to for 11 years, Rosie sat between Carson and Patrice and ate a full plate of food and contributed to the conversation 3 times without prompting. Small contributions, careful and considered, but they were there. A woman named Sandra, who wrote her own heritage soft ale and worked as a veterinary technician, asked Rosie about the animals on the farm, and they talked for 20 minutes about goats, specifically about the personalities of goats, which Rosie had opinions about that were both detailed and enthusiastic, and which made Sandra laugh in a way that was genuine rather than performed. Carson watched Rosie's face during that conversation and filed away what he saw there. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but the early architecture of it, the scaffolding going back up. Back at the clubhouse afterward on the patio, 2 members named Cal and Devlin set up with acoustic guitars and played through a loose, unhurried set of songs while people talked around them. After the 3rd song, Cal looked over at Rosie and said, "You want to try? Not a pressure, not a performance request, just an invitation." Rosie looked at the guitar for a long moment. Then she walked over and sat in the empty chair, and Cal handed it to her and she placed her hands on it with the careful recognition of someone handling something that belonged to a particular part of their history. She played the 3 chords she knew, C and G and A minor, slow and deliberate, and the sound went out into the April afternoon, and Devlin nodded and said, "That's the beginning of about 50 songs right there," which was almost exactly what Patrice had said to her in February. And Rosie looked up at Carson with an expression that had nothing hollow in it at all. He looked back. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? That a child in grief was not unreachable. That the word unreachable said more about the limits of the people trying to reach her than about any fundamental distance in the child herself. That Rosie Callahan had not gone somewhere beyond finding. She had gone somewhere beyond the reach of people who needed her to be okay before she was ready to be okay, who changed the subject when she said her mother's name because her grief made their own grief too present and too demanding. She had gone to the only place available to her, interior, silent, self-contained, and she had waited there, patiently and with remarkable endurance, for someone to come in after her without a plan, without a timeline, without an agenda beyond the simple willingness to sit in the cold and listen. Carson had not set out to change anything that February morning. He had stopped at a feed store for pipe fittings. He had seen a girl sitting in a truck bed with eyes that understood more than they should and less than they needed, and he had done the unremarkable thing of walking over and staying. That was the entire sum of it. He had not possessed special training or particular insight. He had just not kept walking. And not keeping walking had been enough to pull one small thread that turned out to be connected to everything, to Jean's locked-up grief and the journal full of unsent letters and the 3 half-learned guitar chords and the spring ride and the patio and the afternoon in April when Rosie Callahan played C and G and A minor on a borrowed guitar while dogwoods bloomed in the Tennessee hills. 2 months after the spring ride, Patrice called Carson to tell him something. She said that Rosie's teacher, the one who had written unreachable in the semester report, had sent home a new note. The note said that Rosie had raised her hand in class for the first time since September, that she had answered a question about a book they were reading, a question about what a character was feeling and why she wasn't saying it out loud, and that Rosie's answer had been so precise and so quietly devastating that the classroom had gone completely still and Mrs. Pratt had to take a breath before she could respond. The note said that Rosie appeared to be returning and that whatever had changed at home was working. Jean put that note on the refrigerator with a magnet. He put it next to a photograph of Diane that Rosie had asked him to take down from the closet shelf where he had placed it in the early weeks of grief, when seeing her face had been too much. Rosie had asked him to put it back up. He had. And the morning he put it back on the refrigerator, he stood in the kitchen for a long time looking at his wife's face, and then he said her name out loud into the quiet house. Diane, just Diane, and the house held it the way it was always supposed to. Carson heard about the refrigerator note at the July community cookout the Ridge, and Valley MC hosted every summer in a park outside Murfreesboro. Jean and Rosie came, as they had been coming to club events since the spring ride, not as guests anymore, but as people who belonged, which was a different thing entirely. Rosie wore a t-shirt with a sunflower on it, not iron-on but printed, the kind you chose rather than the kind that covered a tear. She spent the first hour helping Patrice set up the food tables, and the second hour playing cards with 2 other kids who had come with their families, and the third hour sitting next to Carson on a picnic bench eating watermelon and telling him about a song she was learning, a real song with more than 3 chords, a song her mother had liked that she had found on her mother's old phone in a playlist labeled Good Days. Good Days, Carson said. Rosie nodded. She made it when she was in treatment. She said music was the thing that helped most when everything else was hard. She wanted to learn all of them, but she said she was going to start with the ones that felt like summer, because summer was when she felt most like herself. Carson looked at this girl who in February had sat motionless in a truck bed with eyes that went nowhere and nowhere and nowhere, who had not spoken her mother's name in the presence of another person for 14 months, who had been described in an official document as unreachable, and had simply been waiting all that time for someone to decide she was worth the reaching. He said, "Which one are you learning first?" Rosie told him the title, a song he knew, one he had heard 100 times. He said, "Your mama had good taste." Rosie smiled, not the fractional, cautious, half-second flicker from the feed store parking lot. A real one, full and unhesitant, the kind that reached her eyes and stayed there. "There it is," Carson said quietly. "What?" Rosie asked, Sunflower turning toward the sun. She looked at him and then she laughed, a short, bright, completely unguarded laugh, and the sound of it went out across the park and into the July afternoon, and Gene Callahan heard it from across the cookout and stopped what he was doing, and just stood there for a moment with his hand over his mouth. He had not heard his daughter laugh in 2 years. He had forgotten, in the way grief made you forget things that were too beautiful to hold, what it sounded like. It sounded like Diane. It sounded like the thing that survived. The Ridge and Valley MC did not start a program after Rosie's story. They did not write a curriculum or design a campaign or announce an initiative. What they did was simpler and harder and more durable than any of those things. They kept showing up. To the cookouts and the toy runs and the community drives and the fall ride and the spring ride. They kept inviting Jean and Rosie, and Jean and Rosie kept coming, and over the months and years that followed, the distance between invited and belonging disappeared entirely. Rosie learned 4 more chords, and then 6, and then stopped counting. She played at the Ridge and Valley Christmas gathering when she was 11, a short set of 3 songs, one of them from her mother's Good Days playlist, and 16 bikers in leather vests sat around a fire pit in December and listened with the full attention of people who understood that what they were hearing was not a performance, but a healing made audible. Patrice drove her to guitar lessons every other Thursday for 2 years, until Rosie's skills outpaced what the local instructor could offer, and Jean found a teacher in Nashville who took her on as a serious student. The morning of her first Nashville lesson, Rosie wore her sunflower shirt and carried her mother's old phone in her jacket pocket, the one with the Good Days playlist, the way Carson carried the things that mattered where he could feel them. Carson saw her once a year at minimum and talked to Jean every month or so, the easy, unscheduled calls of people who had moved past the event that connected them and found something ongoing underneath it. He never thought of himself as having done something significant. He had stopped at a feed store and stayed a little longer than he planned. The significance was always hers, always Rosie's, who had held herself together alone in the cold and quiet for 14 months and kept the journal and kept writing the letters and kept the iron-on patch on her knee as the one piece of her mother she was allowed to carry, and who had looked up in a parking lot on a February morning and locked eyes with a stranger and decided one more time to try. She mouthed those letters to 6 different people before one finally listened, Tyler had once said in a different story about a different child in a different parking lot. But the principle was the same. The trying had to keep happening, and the listening had to happen at least once, and once was enough to change everything. One stranger who stayed. One conversation in the cold, one person who let a child say her mother's name without changing the subject or leaving the room. That was the chain. That was the entire, irreducible, sufficient chain. Years later, when Rosie was 16 and playing guitar with a seriousness that had started to feel like a direction rather than a hobby, she wrote a song. Not for any audience, not initially, just for herself, the way she had written letters in the journal. But she played it for Patrice first, and Patrice cried, and then she played it for Jean, who sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded and his eyes closed and listened all the way through without moving. And then she played it for Carson at the Ridge and Valley summer cookout when she was 17, sitting on the same picnic bench where she had told him about the Good Days playlist. And the song was about a girl sitting in a truck bed in winter who had forgotten how to want things until a stranger with a worn leather vest and patient eyes sat down across from her and did not ask her to be okay and did not ask her to keep going and did not ask her anything except what her mother had been like. And the chorus was 3 lines. You said her name like it was allowed. You stayed when staying cost you nothing and everything. You showed me how to turn back toward the sun. Carson listened to the whole song without speaking. When it was over, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your mama would have loved that." Rosie nodded. "I know," she said. "I wrote it for her, but I also wrote it for you." Because that was what one February morning in a parking lot in Millhaven had been, not a rescue. Not an intervention, not anything that would appear in a report or a training manual or a news headline. Just a man who had seen a child sitting alone in the cold and had walked over and stayed and listened and said her mother's name like it was allowed. That was all. That was the thing that saved her, not the grand gesture or the high-speed chase or the dramatic confrontation, the staying, the listening. The simple refusal to keep walking when something in a child's eyes said, "Please don't go. Thank you for watching this story. Thank you for, if it reminded you that grief in a child doesn't always announce itself with tears, that silence and stillness and withdrawal are the shapes loss takes when there is nowhere safe to put it, and that the most powerful thing any of us can do for a child who is hurting is sit down, stay, and let them say the name of the person they are missing without flinching. Please share it. Subscribe to Bike Diaries because we upload a new story every single day, and every single one of them is about the same thing in the end. About the people who don't keep walking. About the ones who notice and stay and refuse to let ordinary moments remain ordinary when something real is being asked of them. Tell us in the comments what you would have done in that parking lot. And tell us if there is someone in your life who is sitting in the cold right now, waiting for someone to come in after them. Because the only thing standing between that person and the beginning of their way back is one conversation and the willingness to stay in it. Be that person. Show up. Say the name. Stay in the cold. It is the whole thing. It is enough.